Very good. So welcome, everybody. Very nice to see you all. Um, if you can, then please turn on your cameras. It's great to see everybody if that's possible for you. And as we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation, who are partially funding this effort. And of course, the organizers, Linda Boyle, John Lee, Rafael Sadoun, Manfred Chelgi, and Orit Sher and myself are here today. So today we will have a recorded session. Of course, please put your questions in the chat and or it will be monitoring those questions. So we have Chris Janssen, who's a colleague and a friend for a while now. Chris is an assistant professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands in experimental psychology. He obtained his PhD in human-computer action from UCL in 2012. And then before he joined at Utrecht, he was a postdoc at Smith Kettle Eye Research Institute in San Francisco. And so I think a lot of you already know all this, and you know that Chris is very active in the automotive UI community. He recently hosted the conference in Utrecht. So Chris, why don't we get started and with some questions. So you're an HCI researcher, and this includes exploring human automation interaction. And you recently led this really nice exploration of the research into human automation interaction. And you looked at this over the last 50 years. So what did you learn about this topic as it relates to the future of work? So what is the past? What is the present? What is the future of human automation interaction?
Right. Well, thanks, Andrew and Orit and all the others involved in organizing this series for being here first. As I said before, it feels like I'm an honorary member of your lab by now through all these conversations, learning new things every week. Yeah, in the paper, I think mostly it shows that now is an exciting time for human-computer interaction and many other fields, actually, to study human automation interaction. And the reason is that the field has really grown and there's more appreciation for the breadth and the depth, I think. So in the past, automated systems were quite limited in what they could do technologically and therefore also in where they were being applied. And that has gradually increased. And there's at least three ways in which it's increased. One way is in the expansion of domains. So going to apply these automated systems in scenarios where good performance is time critical and safety critical, right? So you can think of power plants or the car. Another way is that these automated systems have moved to more dynamic environments. So from a very constrained space where we're talking with a computer that has a fixed domain about which it reasons, like in an expert system, to having cars on the road in dynamic environments. And these dynamic environments, they change. So you need to, the automation needs to be able to handle those changes in the environment. And I think the third and for me most important and exciting aspect is that more and more people are using automation. And therefore you really see it in many domains. And most of them are non-professional users by now, right? Automation, it used to be something like, well, the automation of an aircraft or of a factory where there was dedicated trained personnel. And now I am one of the non-professional users of automation every day as I use my robot vacuum to make sure that the dog hairs in my home are taken away. And that leads us to the right, and there's more situations like that, right? In our home, we take automated technology with us, our laptops, our phones, many situations where we interact with it. And what we therefore see is that because there's such a breadth in domains and in people that use it, that the field is also growing, right? You can't tackle a problem in human automation interaction with just one discipline. You really need expertise from multiple fields. And I think what's also important is that those fields need to be taken seriously. So sometimes when you have discussions about AI, for example, different fields are seen, well, and then we just apply AI to that field, or we just apply this method to that field. And I think there's actually value in taking these individual disciplines serious, right? We need to get insights from engineers about the technology, but also from designers, from sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, economists, all kinds of fields that I don't know everything about, but I want to know, and I know that they have value, right? So we should embrace those fields, and that's quite challenging because we can't all know all the information from those fields. Maybe I'm talking too long in one go, but you can really also see this at the European level, right? Where there's more and more appreciation also for that. We need to talk about more than just tech. So I think at the European level, there's really been policy initiatives that said, well, if there's data, we need to know where the data comes from. If there's automated decisions, we want to know why that decision was being made. So through that legislative effort, there's been a direct push to technology, but also to the humanities and the social sciences, that we really want to understand how humans use technology. And I really think that's created a tremendous shift if you compare it to 5-10 years ago. And that's exciting.
So there are a couple of things I wanted to, one follow-up question, and then I think you've already alluded to this idea of education, but one of the questions I have here is, so the paper discusses this idea that, it used to be that professionals used automation rather, and then it became, my automated car. I'm obviously not a professional in that. But do you think, as we think of the future of work and as automation becomes better, do you think it almost sort of goes back to, in a sense, professionals using very professional tools for their professional purposes, in contrast to, I'm just using an automated vehicle, which is sort of a more general purpose tool?
Well, in a sense, it's of course a perspective. When do we call it automation? And in fact, that mere definition has shifted a bit, right? From automation, something that's mechanical, to nowadays we automatically assume that it needs to have a chip, but technically it doesn't need to have a chip. Similarly, early on, what's being discussed, so we review 50 years of literature, right, in that paper. What you see in those early 10 years is that some of the things that are talked about as automation there, we now just see as standard practice. So one example is experimental tests done on a computer. Well, for anyone who's in any psychology or HCI related field, we do that every day, and we don't think, let's go talk with the automation today. No, we create our experiment. So it's sort of, it goes to the background. So I guess you're right that it will become normal practice, and that specialists will work with that specialist technology. At the same time, for that to go smooth and to go fluent, there's already the assumption that we've created it in a way that it becomes intuitive to the humans. And I think that's where the value lies, that we really make it in a way that humans can understand it, and that it's also used in a way that's good for, even at a societal level, right? Not just toys for the rich, but technology that can be used by many. And that's challenging, I think. Yeah.
So you spend obviously a great deal of time on education. You're one of the people leading the Master of Science in AI program at Utrecht. So what do you think our students need to learn? What is it that we need to teach them about, such that they can both be productive in future work settings with future work tools, and also such that they can create those tools for the future of work?
Well, I think it differs between students, what they need or should learn, right? And it differs between programs. But if I look at what we try on the AI program, for Utrecht specifically, we really want to focus on this multi and interdisciplinary perspective. So we have quite a variety of students coming in from very different bachelor's degree, from philosophy to a bachelor's in French language to computer science and psychology. And all of those need to come out with a master's degree that's somehow comparable. Of course, fully the same we can't achieve. So that's definitely for me not the ambition. But the trick is to get them at least to a common level, and to provide challenges and to let them see where the value is, both of the discipline that they come from at the bachelor's level already or their background, but also how to use the tools from the other perspectives. So it used to be that when I'm based in a psychology department, right? So I'm mostly concerned with the overlap between AI and the social sciences. It used to be that those social sciences courses were very social science focused, and we would attract students that had a background in social sciences. So in the end, you had students that came out with social science background. And nowadays, with the students that come in and have a social science background, I tell them, well, you don't have to take that course on experimentation. It's a nice course, but you got that covered. Go do that machine learning course or that fundamental mathematics course. And to the students that are coming at it from a more computer science background, I tell them, okay, you could do another course on another programming language, or you can come to me and learn how you need to do an A/B test, because when you get that job at Google, this is one of the things that Google is doing all day, right? And that was kind of tricky because you're trying to sell, like there's lots of things sexy and attractive in AI at the moment. That's why there's a huge influx in students. But cognitive science is typically not on the mind of most of the students when they come in, right? That is sexy and hot. So how do you sell those sciences, which I think is essential for their understanding to people that don't have that background? So we really tried to do that by showing not just a typical, like, this is how you do an experiment, this is an intervention with a medicine or with a classical experimental psychology experiment, but rather picking examples, for example, from the best papers from Chi or from WIST, and showing how experiments are being applied there so they can tie it to technology. And then in lab assignments, have them train more in a technical way. And then on the side, they need to read the die-hard cognitive science literature, which is a struggle for them. Or not for everyone, but for most, right? But at least they understand its relevance, why they need to know it in the long term. And I always then hope that they have a little context, either from their background in cognitive science, if that's where they're coming from, or from that engineering application, to see where its place is. And I think we've been quite successful. The students like those courses, and we have more influx on the number of students. But it's tricky. And in the beginning, I always feel like, well, I'm the clown trying to tell them, this is really valuable for you. This is really valuable for you. And you say it 20 times. And you tell them, you are the expert on whatever domain is your bachelor's degree. And you tell me. And it's sometimes a difficult conversation for students because they're not used to being told that they are already the expert. But you tell them, well, you actually are. Now learn about these other things. But it's nice.
So some of the things that you were talking about to me sound a lot like, multiple disciplines and learning to talk to each other. And this is the topic of one of your recent papers on, looking at automated vehicles and how do we talk to each other coming from different disciplines. So do we have a common language? Where are those holes? So can you tell us more about that? Because it's not just at the let's get a master's degree, it's at the let's conduct research level as well, where we need that common language.
Right. And this is nice that I can tell it to my students, because I tell them, well, you have trouble understanding the language. I had that yesterday as well in a professional setting. I don't think we always have a common language. I mean, ideally, there's the common language of science, but even that is not common, right? Some people have science through the development of a technology. Some have science through a philosophical argument or an experiment. So I don't think there is a common language right away. But what helps, I think, is conversations like this one, and similarly conversations with the students or going to conferences. And for example, when I go to Chi, I always go to the talks that are really on topic for my expertise, but I always try to walk around the demos and see what the latest tech is, for example, because I'm always amazed at how far the technology is compared to what my understanding was. Right there, I learned something new, and it triggers ideas of where scientific insights from psychology can come in. And I think the paper that you referred to is a good example of that. So this started at a workshop where we had a seminar, and we had a 1.5 hour meeting on simulations, and everyone walked in, I know everything about simulations. And then we had a conversation, and within the first 5 minutes we got stuck, because based on what we thought simulations were, we had no common ground at all. So I came at it from, I know everything about simulations of the human mind, so I know what we're going to talk about. And the colleague who came more from an engineering perspective felt like, well, I know everything from how we simulate virtual cars driving on roads and potential scenarios. So I know what we're talking about here. And of course, simulating a car driving around is very different from simulating a person. So in the beginning, that was frustrating, but these were all nice people. So it was still a fun conversation. And I think in the end, through that conversation, at least we understood what the different angles were. Probably we've still overlooked many angles, but a couple we've identified. And then we could use that to also identify, well, where might be opportunities. So it turned out that there's at least 3 ways that you could simulate in the traffic domain. So you can simulate something about the person, or you can simulate something in the world, or you can simulate some task that they do in the world. And typically we only tend to think of one of those dimensions. But if you now, and then there's assumptions that go with it, right? Like, an experiment in the real world can never be controlled because it's the real world and you can't control the real world. Well, you can actually control that other dimension of scenario. So I think Wendy Ju's work on ghost cars is a perfect example of that, right? The world, so they have a person in a suit sitting in a car, and it looks like the car is driving itself, and it's in the real world with real people, but the scenario is very constrained. The car drives up to a traffic junction, and they observe what pedestrians do. So it's a nice way where there's a form of simulation that I had never thought of as simulation, but I now do, right? Simulating as if the car is driving itself in a real environment where you can actually make a meaningful contribution. So I thought that was helpful to me, at least, and I hope to others, about how these interactions happen. And that's probably the case for many fields, right? So I think I always say at these meetings, I like it if someone tells me that I'm wrong, even though I also like to be told that I'm right. And I could do the told you so song, but for scientifically, it's nice if you're told that you're wrong, because then you can actually further your understanding.
Thank you. So we talk about different disciplines, and I have a question that has to do with terminology, because we started this conversation talking about automation.
Yeah.
And then you talked about a master in AI. And I'd like to kind of clarify the relationship between automation and AI.
Well, I use AI when I'm teaching on my AI program because it's the program, but more generally in the scientific literature, I typically tend to talk more about automation, as I think it's a wider term, as there's, and I also tend to not define AI, because that's one thing I've learned in Utrecht, that whatever definition I give of AI, there's at least one colleague that doesn't agree with it. And there's at least a fifth of the students that don't agree with it. But the idea is that there's AI, that it's a learning system, for example, right? And in some forms, there's the idea that AI has something to do with intelligence, whereas I think for an automated system, it doesn't necessarily have to learn. It doesn't necessarily have to do with intelligence. But typically, an AI system can be encompassed in the set of automated systems. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's important to kind of, as we have multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary teams, both of students and researchers, to kind of engage. And also, I really like your approach. Maybe it's not yet the time to define in kind of final terms a particular disciplines.
Well, it helps to be precise, but I guess you need to ensure that you're using it really to get to that precision, that you're using it in a constructive way. And what you sometimes see is with the terminology of AI is that people say AI is this definition, and then whatever is not that definition, we're going to stop the conversation. So I don't like that type of conversation. So with my students, I like it to be embracing of various views. So I give some ideas of where AI might be useful or what directions it might take. The philosophers are typically way better than I am at defining what AI is and what it could be. So I always say, go take your philosophy class and you'll gain insights, and then come tell me afterwards.
Yeah, I wish all of our students, including myself, would take philosophy classes. I think that's
I know
as we're starting to think about.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of, by the way, I'm waiting for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, kind of feel free to type briefly and then I'll call on you. But meanwhile, last time we met in Auto UI, we talked about interruptions, and I know that you've been doing a lot of work about interruptions, and in the work that Andrew and I have been doing, thinking about working in automated car, we rely on your model that you developed, which describe how people might transition between non-driving related tasks and then back to driving and forth. So can you talk a little bit about this model and process?
Right. So the general idea there is that we try to understand transitions of control in semi-automated vehicles. So the car has been driving for a while, maybe the human driver or the person in the car was doing something else, but at a certain point, the car faces a situation where it needs assistance at the minimum. So there's a transition of some of the functionality of the car to the person. And what you see in public discourse, but also in scientific discourse and many studies, is that it's typically thought of as a hard task switch. So you really go from not working on the driving task to working on the driving task, or driving, right? But if you look at the literature on interruptions and interleaving, and that's also been discussed in some of these other conversations, right, by Anna Cox and Shamsi Iqbal and Gloria Mark, there are quite advanced models of how humans handle situations where they were doing something first and then need to go to something else. Typically in the office, right? You're working on your manuscript and a student walks in or a colleague walks in or the phone rings. Like, how do you handle it? And the insight that we had for the paper is that applying that framework really adds a lot of precision. So instead of saying this is the situation where we're switching, you can see it as a more gradual process where there's actually a wealth of psychological theory about different stages in that process. So we still haven't covered or solved all of that, but at least what we've identified is that there are these steps, and that for each of these steps that you can look into the literature, what's known about it, and there's a lot of work outside of the car domain. So I don't want to claim that I have invented a whole new model. I actually think that a lot of it was known, but we have tried to put pieces of the puzzle together to make it more digestible for people that are concerned with the domain of automated driving. And I think that's what's useful for science, at least I hope. It's also tricky because when you look at interdisciplinary contributions, some people that read a paper like that, they'll go like, we know all of this. We've had reviews like that. So you go like, yeah, of course we know all of this because it's a reviews, but the way that we put it together is new, and the way that it can help the community forward is new. So that's where we're trying to be helpful. And you see it at venues like CHI, right? And maybe there's quite some students watching, and it's been CHI rejection month or acceptance month for the lucky few. But many papers at these conferences and also journals, they get rejected, and it's not always because the work isn't great, right? It's sometimes also a fact that merely a consequence of that someone from a different discipline looked at it and they have some expectation of what a study or science concerns, or what is the proper test, or whether it's valid, and that holds for everyone. I've had many papers where I got those types of critiques, that it was a driving simulator and therefore it has nothing to do with driving at all, or that it was driving and therefore it has nothing to do with cognition, right? The other way around, because it was too applied, and it's a very difficult balance to strike. So I haven't solved that equation yet fully myself, of how to pitch all that work, but I'm slowly getting better at it. So yeah.
I think it's
keep holding on for the students. Don't get discouraged. It might have been coincidence. I think that's important. And there's value in engaging with it. And actually that negative review can provide you an insight in how to pitch the work better next time for that person coming from the other community, because they'll tell you what their expectations were if you had a good reviewer. So next time you can anticipate it for the writing, hopefully.
So thank you for sharing that, because I think that's very helpful, especially for students to hear that rejections come for different reasons, and they're kind of, it encourages us, or it should encourage us to kind of tackle the topic and explain it for people that coming from different disciplines. Sorry, but this discussion of disciplines remind me a talk that I heard by Hiroshi Ishii a while ago, in which he talked about interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary research, and transdisciplinary research. And it seemed to me that as we talk about auto UI, like we might reach into kind of the transdisciplinary, where we really have to stop looking at disciplinary perspective and try to, teach interaction designers cognition and teach, computer scientists cognition and so forth, but rather think about it. This is a holistic problem that we have to tackle from different angles with different knowledge. I'd love to hear your thought about that notion.
This gets close to the detailed discussions of the discipline of definitions and whether you are or are not. So I'm treading on a difficult terrain here, but it's good that you poach me to be more specific. I think there's some truth in it. So I think you see it the clearest at CHI, one of the big HCI, Human Computer Interaction conferences. So is CHI a discipline, or is CHI a collaboration of different disciplines? I think by now, what are we, 50 years into the CHI, or 40 at least? I think we can say it's a discipline on its own, right? And the same holds for some forms of AI, which also used to be a collaboration between computer science and psychology and philosophy. So I think it's valuable. If there's some integration and there's a new field, I think that's valuable. However, the danger becomes that can there still be place for insights from the original discipline that contributed to it? That's my concern in all of this. And when we had the last Auto UI, I was involved in one of the panel discussions there, as that's one of the main issues I also see in the automotive user interfaces conferences. Does everything need to be directly in the car? Or are we also helped by having basic engineers at the conference that just know how to build something? Or do we need, if I need to pitch for my own community, proper psychologists who can just run a very careful, controlled study to gain that one insight about the human mind that can inform the car? And I think there needs to be a space for that as well. But that's difficult because definitely at conferences, there's limited slots, right, of how many talks you can see. But I think there's value in actively continuing to invite those people, because even though we see our own field as becoming one field, AI is one field, human computer interaction is one field, those other disciplines are also still learning. So at the moment where we branch off, how do we make sure that we still gain those insights from those other fields? I guess that's where the challenge lies, where I don't have an easy solution.
Well, thank you, Chris. This was a very interesting discussion. We covered a lot of ground, and so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks
And
for having me.
I guess what we'll do now is just briefly wrap up. So hope to see you all next week. We're going to have Saif Savage. She's going to be talking about the invisible workers in AI. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and I hope everybody can stick around for an informal part of the conversation. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Welcome. Thank you.